Today we are talking about Blizzard's announcement of what is going to come in Season 3, which is going to be an ensemble of dungeons, and Blizzard wants you to vote your favorite dungeons from current season and Season 1 who will make part of Season 3 dungeon pool of Mythic Plus. This was an idea thought about before, allowing players to choose their favorite dungeons, and then sometimes it happened to be a complete disaster. Now, Blizzard isn't exactly pointing out what the pool of dungeons will be in Season 3. We know from the Blizzard's own roadmap that there's gonna be another dungeon, brand new dungeon added in the next patch, so it could be something like 4 of these favorite dungeons, plus the new dungeon added, plus some of the older dungeons that usually make a return in every season since Dragonflight. But in general, we're gonna think about 4 of the best dungeons from Season 1 and Season 2 that could make it into Season 3 pool of dungeons. So in here, as you can see, we have 9. We have the 4 of Season 1, the 4 of Season 2, plus the extra added of Operation Floodgate, right? Now, there are some question marks about how players choose these dungeons, because some players, for example, immediately aim their answer at the easy ones, what they remember being easy. For example, if we go by the difficulty level of dungeons in Season 1, the winners, at least of these available dungeons, would have to be the Dawnbreaker, City of Threads, and Arakara for Season 1. When it comes to Season 2, so this season, in this very first month of the season, then in that case the winner for easiest dungeons would be Dark Flame Cleft and the Rookery. But then there is another side of the player base who would go a completely opposite angle of this. Not about which dungeon is easy or which dungeon is hard, but rather these dungeons are going to be in the pool, which means they will get their hero track gear from the end of the key and also their mid-track gear from the vault. And what do I care about is which of the dungeon has my best in slot, for example, trinkets. For example, just a random dungeon Arakara happens to have a certain trinket which is quite good for many specs. Or, just to stay in the current season, you would have something like the Priory. Priory, which is at the moment the harder dungeon to complete, while simultaneously being the second most run dungeon. Why? Because it happens to have a pretty good trinket for quite a few specs. So you could have one side of the player base trying to push to vote easy dungeons, and then the other side of the player base trying to push to get easy best in slot gear from the dungeons they want in Season 3. Now, luckily for some of these dungeons will be overlapping in their choice, and we have our first dungeon that will make it in the top 4 very likely is going to be Arakara. Arakara was the more run dungeon, one of the easier dungeons of Season 1, who also has the Sack Brood trinket. So we believe very, very likely that this is going to end up winning. One of the winners will have to be Arakara, simply because of the combination of being an easy dungeon plus best in slot trinkets available in that dungeon. Funny that the very same place where Arakara is from also has likely the worst dungeon, which definitely will not be chosen, so we can already exclude him from the possibility of making it into the top 4 of these dungeons, which is City of Threads. So City of Threads was an awful dungeon. It was way too long. It had the minigame of Catch the Intruder, which is awful, of course, not just because it broke your pace in the dungeon, but also one of the things players like the most doing in dungeons is turbo mega AoE pools, and guess what you don't do in that part of the dungeon is exactly those pools. Plus the bosses aren't particularly easy in City of Threads. It's also a long dungeon. It's just a combination of badness, just the opposite pretty much of Arakara. If we were expecting any of the dungeons to make it with Arakara, it would be the opposite for City of Threads. Another dungeon, though, we can already preemptively cut from the possible pool of choices would have to be the Stonevault. You know, the Stonevault not only did it not have a particularly OP trinket that was being sought after by many specs, but also it was quite the long dungeon. You had 4 different bosses, you had the 2 different wings, one of which, at least, the monster wing, being quite annoying and difficult to go through. And it was overall considered one of the harder dungeons in Season 1. So it's unlikely to imagine many players ganging up together either because they found Stonevault easy or because they find Stonevault to have juicy loot and therefore vote the Stonevault. That would be somewhat unlikely. So next to City of Threads, we can kind of also cut the Stonevault out of the possible winners. Now, in terms of possible winners, we can still use as a possibility to have the Dawnbreaker. The Dawnbreaker did have some decent loot in there, but in particular it was mostly chosen due to how quick and fast it was. You could fly in the dungeon, you could move very quickly throughout the dungeon. It only had 3 bosses, the first boss being very early on as well. And also the bosses themselves not being particularly difficult. It was much tougher to go through the trash, but either way, it was a pretty fast dungeon and easy. Overall, in terms of ease, by far, it was the easier one in Season 1, at least according to the larger player base. So it is also a possible election for one of the 4 favorite dungeons right now. Now, there is 2 more dungeons I would like to personally eliminate from the pool myself. I am using my veto option of not wanting the Rookery and Dark Flame Cleft in the next season. So, the thing with the Rookery is that, number 1, the trash is very annoying. From the first pack all around the first boss with these spam lightning bolt casters, it's just annoying to go through and having to have this level of interrupts throughout all of this first pack of mobs. And then if that's not enough, you go past the first boss and you start having the suck mobs, which are even more annoying, not just for melee but also for casters. Not to mention these annoying clowns constantly jumping around and charging the casters in the back. And even the last phase, the last part with the caster doing the absorb shield on everyone plus the big guy doing the pulsing AoE, and not to mention the annoyance of the last boss of having to be spread around, and then even for the higher key pushers, that boss reaching 7+ minute level of annoyance with his massive shield. Yes, you know, it doesn't look that great. And also, yes, it has a decent trinket. The Entropic Scarding Core is okay, but it's not like one of the most sought after anyways. The loot in there is not amazing. So I would like to happily cut the Rookery out of the pool for next season. The other one next in line would have to be, as mentioned, Dark Flame Cleft. You know, yes, it's very fast, yes, it's very quick, and yes, it's the S tier dungeon right now in terms of ease in this season. So logic would say it would be one of the more voted ones because it's easy and quick. However, I think the whole cart mechanic did irreparable damage to the reputation of this dungeon, and the entire light mechanic in the last boss as well. I just don't find it that nice to go through. Even though the dungeon itself, it is fast, it is quick. You have, sure, 4 bosses instead of 3, the usual perfect number for many players, but the second one is quite quickly after the first one, and even the third boss is quite quickly after the second one. They are literally one pull away next to each other, so it's pretty quick, it's pretty fast. But, you know, I don't know, the whole cart thing, the role play around the cart when you get chased by the boss, plus the entire last boss mechanic, I'm not a fan. I would not like to see Dark Flame Cleft again. It's cool that you experimented with it. That's fine though, we can just keep it there for 1 season, no more. So, with the exclusion of Dark Flame Cleft and City of Threads and Rookery and Stonevault, now we have 5 dungeons remaining. We wanted to see the top 4, so what we have left is Arakara, is Cinderbrew, and then it's Floodgate, Priory. I think Arakara and Dawnbreaker are pretty good candidates to win, so what's left is choosing between Mythic, Floodgate and Priory. I would like to put Floodgate in. I think Floodgate is a pretty good dungeon. It has a pretty good mix of big pools with a bunch of mobs and smaller pools. The bosses, sure, there is 4 different bosses, but I like the flow of the dungeon. It had to have its usual nerfs post-release, of course, because early on it was much more problematic than it is now. I think now it is in a much better spot than before. So I think overall it turned out to be a pretty decent dungeon. The competition with Floodgate will have to be with Cinderbroom Meadery, which one of the two? And you know, to me, Cinderbroom Meadery is still quite poor. Cinderbroom Meadery is, by the way, the same layout as Stonevault. You have the first room right into the first boss, then divided into two different wings, and then you loop back into the final boss after only basically one pull. So in this setup, it's similarly bad as the Stonevault, except it gets worse, because you don't even get to play this in some ample wide rooms, or better yet, even in open space. You are stuck in corridors, having to deal with dozens and dozens of nameplates spawning, because the hobgoblins dying are spawning like 10 different blobs. You have bees everywhere, you have kegs being spawned, you also have to focus before they explode and kill you. It's just filled with trash, like literal trash fills the entire dungeon. Yeah, if that wasn't enough, you also have some minnow random mobs in the first room just joining to make your screen even more cluttered. You know, it's just a bit too much. If they cut it down a bit more, perhaps it would have been more manageable, but really at the moment I think it's a bit too crowded of a dungeon. I know they wanted to give the feeling, of course, with all the bees and the blobs of the beer and whatnot, but it's a bit overboard as a dungeon. So I would say Operation Floodgate makes it over Meadery. And the last one, the one we left for last, is Priory. So Priory is a pretty interesting situation right now. So for me, by the way, it's the best dungeon this season, and by far the best dungeon and one of the better ones. I think, first of all, plays on nostalgia, you know, Scarlet Monastery kind of dungeon. One of the OG goats of dungeons, but reimagined for a more modern WoW. You do have optional mini-bosses, which means routing choices, routing options, which is not something common you see nowadays in dungeons. You can have very large pools, very big pools, which is always enjoyed by players in dungeons. A lot of the dungeons, a big part of the dungeon, of course, will be in open space. So you have room to go, you have room to move in this dungeon. You can still, of course, mount. You can repair, you can go faster, unlike most of the other dungeons being close up inside a building. There are some annoyances here and there, certainly. The whole first part with the insufferable sharpshooters jumping around and shooting random DPS or healers, the traps flying everywhere, some overtuned mobs like the light spawns and their beam of death they do a bit too often, and more importantly, if you pull two of them, they can go both on the same player. You know, some of these things are a bit annoying, but overall, it's a great dungeon to play in. It's not one of the more liked simply because it's hard. At least right now in Season 1, it shows up to be the least high completed dungeon compared to others, like for example Darkflame Cleft or the Rookery, but that doesn't make it any worse, really. Also, there is the opposite that we mentioned at the beginning. Even though we just said it's one of the harder ones, at the very high level of keep pushing, it is also the second most run dungeon. And that's what we mentioned at the beginning, because this dungeon also happens to have the Priory trinket, the signet of the Priory. So obviously, for many players who want to vote which dungeons they would like to see next for the next season, many will likely be headed towards wanting their best in slot trinkets to stay in the dungeon pool, and Priory does have one of the better trinkets for practically all of 2-minute timings, cooldown kind of specs. So that's why, despite their current difficulty level, it is likely to possibly still see this dungeon being voted quite a bit because of its goodness in terms of rewards within the dungeon. So I think that in the end we could say that we can imagine seeing a list of top 4 winners being Arakara, Dawnbreaker, Priory and Floodgate. There are some question marks here and there, especially if players go more for what they thought was easy, with something like Darkflame Cleft, for example, being voted quite a bit over others. But you know, some others I'm a bit more confident in how they will not be that that fondly remembered or fondly voted for, like Stonevault or like City of Threads, for example. So this poll will last a whole week, so we will see by the end of this, I guess, next weekend, how will this have gone. But for today, this was the announcement from Blizzard on this new voting poll for the dungeon pool of Season 3. You are, of course, free to go and vote for yourself, whether you are in EU or NA. They have different polls available. You can go and cast your own vote. Of course, knowing that if you vote anything other than what I just said, I will be deeply disappointed in your tastes of dungeons. But for today, though, on this Saturday, we can call it quits for now. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, so late, I have to eat in like 25 minutes. We were just in time to finish with the video.